I'm really pleased to see such a good turnout. For those of you who don't know me, my name's David McCartney. I'm an addiction doctor, and I work here at the Ashley Ainsley. And I want to introduce our speaker. How the format's going to go is we're going to have a presentation for about half an hour on some research, and then we'll have an opportunity for some discussion afterwards. So I hope you'll participate in the discussion. Peter Hillen is here to present research that he's done. It's around the role of belief in the pathway of recovery from problematic substance misuse. Peter is a research fellow at Edinburgh University. He's got a PhD in social work, which he did at the University of Edinburgh, and he's going to tell you a bit about his own experience himself. But he's worked with drug and alcohol users in health and social care settings. I don't think I would say anything else. I'll just pass on to you, and you can say a bit more about who you are and what you do. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, David. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you today. And thank you all for coming. It's nice to see a few familiar faces. So, just to say, I'm going to be recording this seminar. So, when it comes to discussion at the end, and if you don't feel comfortable with any of your comments being recorded, let me know and I can cut those out. So I'm going to be presenting the findings of my PhD research, which I did in the social work department at the University of Edinburgh between 2012 and 2016, 17-ish. Just a few acknowledgements. First of all, my research was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and obviously supported by the University of Edinburgh, but I'm here in the capacity as a research fellow at Edinburgh University. So I've kind of aimed this presentation at health and social care workers, so hopefully I'm not going to get too bogged down in kind of academic detail, and we don't really have a lot of time to get too technical about theories, etc. But if you've got any questions at the end, hopefully we can explore some of those things in the discussion. So I just want to tell you a bit about my own experience and my motivation for, and I guess inspiration for doing this research. So back in, I think it was 2002 or 2003, I started working in an emergency access homeless hostel for the homeless in Edinburgh, run by Crossreach, which is an organisation, I guess, based on, inspired by Christian faith. And I guess, I've got my own Christian faith, and so I started to think a bit about the relationship between faith and substance misuse and recovery. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But during that time, I attended a program in Egypt run by an organisation called Freedom, and they had a program essentially based around 12-step model, but they had Christians and they had Muslims doing recovery together, sometimes in groups together, sometimes in separate groups. So this engagement raised even more questions for me about the relationship between faith, religion, spirituality, belief, and recovery. After that, I then worked in a residential supported community for men with addiction issues, again based on Christian principles. It had a 12-step program, but also a strong spiritual element. And I guess I saw some people with faith, or with a strong sense of spirituality, whose lives were really transformed or changed, partly through the inspiration of their faith or spirituality, while I saw other people who had maybe this equally fervent spirituality or faith who just descended into downward spiral. And I'm just thinking of some of the people I got to know, and someone who died, when I got to know them, and sorry, I'm just getting a little bit emotional thinking about that, but that's kind of my background and my motivation. So I developed a lot of questions. So I think it's relevant to think a bit about the historical relevance of spirituality and religion to substance use, misuse, addiction, recovery, because most of us work in essentially secular workplaces with secular ethoses, but there's a long history of tackling substance misuse with religion, with spirituality in Scotland. So we have the temperance movement, which was evolved in the early 19th and into the 20th century. They saw alcohol as a moral problem that was best dealt with through moral reform or through religious reform. And then obviously we have Alcoholics Anonymous, which emerged in the earlier 20th century, which introduced a spiritual program and the idea of higher power and spiritual awakening, and maybe the way that the higher power concept has been interpreted has been secularized over time, but still very much a spiritual program. So just a little bit about policy and research background, which informed my research. So one of the key reports, which was published in 2010, commissioned by the Scottish Government, was Research for Recovery, and it proposed that pathways to recovery are diverse, spanning secular, spiritual, and religious frameworks of personal transformation. So there's an acknowledgement in policy that there are a range of different ways that people can recover, including spiritual and religious frameworks. In the same year, another report was published by an independent inquiry suggesting that faith and spirituality, not necessarily based on a theocratic view, might be important in recovery to foster empowerment and engagement. So, there's a huge amount of literature, mostly coming from North America, which looks at the significance of religion and spirituality in recovery. One review in 2007 looked at a range of these studies and suggested that overall there was a positive relationship between religion and spirituality in recovery. But obviously these things are very complex things to study and to determine the relationship between, first of all, what spirituality means, or how is that demonstrated in behaviour, or how beliefs impact people's recovery behaviour is, I would suggest, quite esoteric and difficult to make those connections. So I think these findings should be looked at critically. But I found that there were very few UK or Scottish-based studies, and so the main aim of my research was to shed some light on the role of spiritual, religious and secular existential beliefs in recovery experience in the Scottish context. So I came in, I guess, particularly interested in spirituality and religion, but I guess from an ethical viewpoint and also to get a broader picture, I incorporated secular existential beliefs, and I'll try and explain what those mean after I've talked about my research method. So I recruited my participants from a range of health and social care centres, recovery communities and organisations, mutual aid groups, and my final sample was a group of 20 individuals who were in various stages of recovery from problematic substance use. So they had to have either an issue with alcohol or with heroin. In reality, most of them had issues with polydrug use. So they were half and half, male and female, between 31 and 60 years of age, and quite a range of experience of recovery from 6 months to 35 years, so quite a diverse range of experience. And they were all living in Edinburgh, Lothians, Glasgow or Fife. So my data collection method was semi-structured interviews based around a narrative approach. So just encouraging. So I mean, I had a list of questions where I asked people about their problematic substance use, their recovery, and the role of beliefs in the recovery. Asking them about their belief background, any communities they engaged with, any particular behaviour they attached to their beliefs, and any particular experiences, whether they be defined as spiritual or emotional experiences in the recovery that were significant for the recovery. And I tried to just encourage people to tell their stories about recovery. So in terms of analysis, all the interviews were recorded, transcribed and anonymised. So any names that I'll be using today are pseudonyms. And I used a thematic narrative analysis approach to analyse the interviews. So trying to identify key themes in the accounts, but also looking at the element of how people told their stories. And I used some what's been called restorying, so trying to gather people's accounts to create a kind of a sequential narrative. And I also used a technique called thematic mapping, so just a visual representation, looking at, first of all, their problematic substance use, and looking at their recovery, and just mapping the different factors that had an influence on their recovery. So I think it's important just to be clear about what I mean when I'm talking about spiritual, religious and secular. And I guess the overarching term is existential beliefs. So these are beliefs that concern the nature of one's existence and one's purpose and meaning in life. So all these beliefs fall within this category. And this is my attempt to explain the overlap between these quite complex concepts, I guess. If you ask a religious studies scholar to explain what religion is, you could probably have a debate with them for hours. And equally, spiritually has been described as a fuzzy concept, and there's a lot of debate over what that means. And I think it really depends who you ask in terms of what that means. But there is, generally speaking, a big overlap between spirituality and religion. Religion is rooted in religious traditions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and is normally based around some sense of authority or dogma and scripture. Whereas spirituality tends to be more subjective. Well, at least one type of spirituality tends to be more subjective, based on personal experience, based on connection with inner self. But equally, if someone might say they're spiritual, and what they might mean is actually that they have got a strong religious belief, but they choose to define it in terms of spiritual language rather than religious language. But they have these kind of often have these common things in common in terms of relationship, whether that's relationship with other people or relationship with a God or a higher power, a transcendent being, another. Community is normally a part of religion and spirituality, less so in some types of spirituality, and some kind of ritual, whether that's prayer, meditation, yoga, some kind of spiritual reading. Secular beliefs are normally defined by what they're not, so they're not religious. I've given some examples of the type of secular belief. Atheism, agnosticism tends to incorporate a materialistic worldview, a belief that reality is based only on what we can see and what we can sense through our senses. But as will become apparent, there is some overlap between spirituality and secular beliefs. So I don't want to get bogged down too much in theory. I want to try and bring out some of the accounts some of the narratives of my participants, because I think that's what's really interesting about my research. I'm going to put up a few different quotes, so I'm just going to let you read them and just talk around them. And just at the end of each quote, I've given you an idea of obviously gender, type of substance, the main types of substance that were problems for them, and the length of years in recovery. So I think Jo is quite an interesting example in terms of her beliefs. She was happy with God, higher power, spirit of the universe, power for good. She came from a Roman Catholic background, but she was sympathetic with Buddhism. But she was unorthodox in the sense that she had believed in universalism, so believed in the truth of all beliefs. She was also quite critical of religious hierarchies in the Catholic Church. She was strongly influenced by 12-step philosophy and spirituality. And in terms of her practice, she was involved in AA, but also in attending Mass, singing in the choir, praying in private. And she preferred to think of herself as spiritual rather than religious, even though she had some vestiges of religious belief and practice. So if we just look at Jo as an example, you can see that it's quite difficult to fit her into a spiritual or religious or secular category. These categories don't really help us to understand people's beliefs. So I had to come up with my own kind of framework for understanding beliefs. So I defined this idea of cultural belief systems, which I've called defined as established intellectual, social and practical frameworks for giving life meaning, purpose and structure. So these would include things like Christianity, 12-step philosophy, Islam. So they incorporate a central meta-narrative, so a story that we use to look at the world, that we use to understand reality. They have related theories. So if we use AA as an example, so powerlessness, for example, ways of speaking. So you might talk about rock bottom in AA. Texts, the big book, role models, Dr. Bob, Bill Wilson, sub-narratives. So there may be little stories that people use, maybe experiences that they've come across in their encounters in AA groups that have become part of the mythology, if you like, of these belief systems. Communities that they attend, and practices and values, whether they be communal or personal. So among my participants, these were the primary belief systems that I identified: 12-step, Christianity, Buddhism, and various secular philosophies. And these were not... So most people drew on different belief systems. So perhaps combining Buddhism and 12-step philosophy, for example. And they also draw on a range of subcultures. So if you think about Christian denominations, for example, so they may have been involved in Roman Catholic churches or Presbyterian churches, or they may have been involved with AA or NA. And to portray the kind of the idiosyncratic nature of people's beliefs, I defined this idea of personal belief systems. So it's the unique combination of existential beliefs that individuals adopt to make sense of the world, their lives, and bring meaning to their existence. So people draw on these established cultural belief systems, and the way they adopt them can be orthodox, one end of the spectrum, or syncretic, so taking elements of different cultural belief systems and bringing them together, and perhaps in a pick and mix way, which is sometimes in spirituality people have quite syncretic beliefs where they draw on different belief systems to construct their own belief system. And the term bricolage has been used in some sociological theory. And I think the 12-step philosophy of the God of your understanding supports the syncretism in particular. It encourages people to perhaps move away from orthodoxy. That's just an idea. They may also draw on different cultural elements that aren't necessarily from the established cultural belief systems, so a belief in aliens or practicing Reiki, things which don't necessarily fit within their primary cultural belief system that they adopt. And people's personal belief systems are not static, they're transitory, they're fluid, and they can change from one stage of recovery to the next. So I want us to think about community. So Billy thought of found spirituality in her engagement with NA. She thought of it as a spiritual house. She talked about sensing an energy there, a sense of belonging, and this was part of her spirituality. She had a what I would call it a kind of a secular spirituality. Nina, she was influenced by Christianity, and she found real encouragement through her engagement in attending church and making bread for communion, helping people in church. Interestingly, Nina had a very secular recovery experience. Her recovery was sustained through mainly smart recovery group or smart type recovery group, drawing on CBT ideas. But church became very important for her in terms of helping to sustain her recovery as it developed. And also, if you read that, you can get a sense. It talks about really being a real person. It also helped her establish a new identity, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. So this table, which hopefully you can read, just gives you an overview of the different types of community that people engaged with and were important to varying degrees in their recovery and in different stages. It's hard to portray in a table the nuances, but that gives you an idea of the different types of communities that people engaged with. And often during their drug use there was a sense of incongruence or social alienation in communities, engaging with communities, but the belief communities were important in terms of giving a sense of belonging, safety, sharing with others, and helping, like Nina, she got a sense of worth and increases self-esteem through contributing to her church. Other people talked about volunteering in their AA group, and that helped them to get a sense of belonging. It also helped them to explore beliefs or spirituality, and connect with their God or their higher power. So the next theme is one of spiritual rituals or personal spiritual rituals. So people practiced a range of different types of rituals, mainly prayer, meditation, and spiritual readings. And you can see some people used a combination of different types of rituals. And for several of my participants, these were really important aspects to their recovery. And again, it's hard to portray the degree of importance in this table, but and quite a number of them combined spiritual rituals to create a routine ritual practice. So having these rituals gave them an alternative to the drug-using rituals that they were once involved in, and also help them to connect with their belief systems and connect with their belief communities that we're engaged with. Mark's an interesting example because he had essentially a secular belief framework, materialistic view of the world. And he when he first attended NA, he couldn't really get the prayer side of it, but he eventually adopted it in a kind of in a secular way, and it became really important for him. And also his spiritual reading was the Just for Today book, and he'd also experimented with meditation, but these rituals became very, very important for him. And rituals were important in different ways. So prayer was important in terms of connecting with God, providing strength, giving thanks or expressing gratitude. One lady I interviewed, I find quite interesting. She didn't really express very strong religious belief when I first started talking about her, but eventually I got out of her that every night since she was sober, she gave thanks for being sober, even though she had a very vague concept of God. Meditation or mindfulness was important for giving people peace of mind, helping them to connect with themselves and also out with themselves, whether that was to the universe or to God. And mindfulness was important as a kind of a secular alternative for people who had secular belief systems. And also spiritual readings, whether that was some kind of 12-step literature, Bible, or Buddhist literature, was important in terms of helping them to explore belief systems, inspiration, devotion, or giving them a kind of cognitive grounding in their recovery. And I've also already mentioned that routine spiritual practice was really important for some people in giving them an alternative to drug-taking rituals. So the next theme is identity, and the way Amy expressed her change in identity was when she was using drugs, she identified herself as not being a nice person. She lied, she cheated, she stole, and her new identity was about her changing her values, changing the way she behaved, turning hate into love, having compassion for people, and that was mainly through her involvement. Well, she had a Roman Catholic background. She explored different types of Christianity, but NA was actually the main expression of her spirituality. Jasper, he had a very secular belief system, and his identity was about essentially discovering himself, or discovering an idealized version of himself, and connection with the universe. And he had quite an interest in spirituality because it was largely secular in one way, but he also talked about having a sense of connection with the universe and with himself. So people constructed or reconstructed their identities in different ways. For some people it was about reconnecting with childhood religious identity, or reconstructing a spiritual or religious identity. So Amy, she had a strong Catholic upbringing, but she kind of reconstructed her identity to, I guess, move away from orthodoxy to embrace the God of her own understanding, which was certainly less grounded in Catholic theology. I don't really have time to go into all these details, but just moving on to the end, transitioning identities. So people's identities changed, developed over time throughout the recovery. So David, who I'll come on to in a minute, he had quite a transformative spiritual experience early in his recovery, and got heavily involved in NA spirituality and a sort of Christian belief. But as his recovery developed, he moved towards atheism and got involved in Buddhism. And equally, Catherine, she moved from Catholicism to a kind of religious Buddhism to a secular Buddhism. So identity's transformation is important in recovery, and that's been established in a lot of the literature, but it can evolve as recovery evolves. And these identities are reinforced through engagement with belief communities and rituals. So everything's kind of interconnected. So moving on to experiences. So I asked people about if they had any particular emotional or spiritual experiences that were important to their recovery. Anna, she turned up to, to NA for the first time, and had a touching experience for her. And when she looked back at that story, she interpreted that as, well, what we thought as first was a flimsy reed turned out to be the loving and powerful hand of God. And she interpreted that as a kind of a transformative experience. And so she used her belief system, 12-step philosophy, but also she drew on some Christian belief systems to interpret that experience and make sense of that and give meaning to that recovery experience. And I mentioned David. So he was one of two people who had a brush with death. One other participant actually, I think, died on the operating table, and was brought back to life, and that was kind of a watershed for him. Whereas for David, he tried to take his life, and he had no strong Christian or spiritual belief beforehand. But he interpreted that as his mother phoned up and said, "Oh, your brother's going to come through," and he interpreted that experience as God intervening, and he became quite fervently Christian in a non-religious way. So he was involved in kind of Christian 12-step groups. And in NA, but as I said earlier, he moved away from these Christian beliefs. This was really important for his early recovery, but he eventually moved away from his Christian beliefs towards atheism and kind of secular Buddhist practice. Beliefs can be significant in terms of they can be. Individuals can have really transformative experiences, or what's been called quantum change. Other people, Ewan and Anna had kind of spiritual experiences before the recovery, which became important as the recovery developed. So it wasn't a kind of in-your-face transformation, but things kind of accumulated to contribute to the recovery as things went on. I'm just going to see. Whoops, well, there. Sorry, I thought I'd put a few more quotes in. Ewan, he shared some really interesting experiences where he had kind of visions, and Anna as well had kind of visions. And well, Anna at least had, I think she had been coming off drugs for about 5 days, and she had these kind of this vision of her daughter, a kind of transfiguration almost vision that was related that she interpreted as spiritual. Somebody else might argue that it was the impact of her coming off substances, or for you, and he talked about using magic mushrooms and having a sense of Creator God, and eventually his Christian faith became important for him in his recovery. And quite a few people talked about what I've called moments of enlightenment, where they, after they came off drugs, they had a kind of a heightened sense of reality, that everything seemed clear and more vivid. They had a kind of a connection with nature. Quite a few participants had those experiences. But I think these things are quite difficult to understand. Ollie, for example, he had a mental health problem where he had hallucinations and heard voices, possibly drug-induced psychosis or some kind of schizophrenia. And he at the time, he thought that it was the devil speaking to him. So how do you make sense of that? Is it his mental health? Is it some kind of spiritual force interacting with him? And actually, for Ollie, belief, his recovery evolved through engagement with NA spirituality and a belief in a higher power and ritual practice became very important for him, but things were quite confusing for him in those early days when he was on that recovery journey. So those are kind of the main findings around communities, identity, ritual, and meaning making. But a number of challenges also emerged. So some people struggle with spirituality. Rab, for example, struggled with the concept of higher power. That made it difficult for him to engage with I think it was AA community. Catherine experienced discomfort, disillusionment and guilt as a single mother in the Roman Catholic Church, and that eventually led her away from that. Ewan, he had a Christian faith in a recovery community, and he felt that he was discriminated against, persecuted for having a Christian faith. David, who I mentioned before, he was heavily involved in NA for years, but he moved towards agnosticism, and he felt that he was alienated from that community and couldn't really engage with them anymore. So he moved towards kind of secular Buddhist practice, and the whole issue of mental health and substances and hallucination kind of complicates things further. So just some summary and conclusions. Just in terms of the limitations of my research, obviously I advertise for people who are interested in spirituality and religion and beliefs, so it's people who are interested in those things who are going to respond to my research, most likely. Obviously it's a very small sample, so it's not generalizable, but as a somebody, when I was speaking at a conference one time, somebody had a go at me about my research not being generalizable, and I think my reply was that individuals aren't generalizable. You know, we work with individuals and everybody's different, and in a sense it's irrelevant whether it's generalizable or not. You know, you're going to come across somebody who's got strong spiritual or religious beliefs or other kind of belief which you have to help them to support them through. As I said, recovery pathways, they don't fit neatly into spiritual, religious or secular frameworks. They're dynamic and fluid. And cultural belief systems and their component parts can be invaluable sources for building recovery identities and providing meaning-making frameworks, or it can be thought of as a type of recovery capital. And I think something that my research highlights that hasn't really been highlighted before is the significance of spiritual and religious communities, apart from AA and NA, in recovery. As I've said, different types of communities can be important at different stages of recovery. And I think that my research has also highlighted the significance of routine practice of personal spiritual rituals. And in terms of existential beliefs that were most valuable to recovery, these were self-belief and belief in other people. These are the kind of beliefs, secular beliefs, that seem to be most significant in terms of supporting people's recovery. And as I said before, there can also be negative aspects to cultural belief systems in terms of shame, social alienation, etc. And I think this quote kind of sums up a lot. I'll let you read that for a minute. So I'd be really interested in hearing your views from your different perspectives. I know we've got a wide range of backgrounds and professional experiences here, in terms of what you think this means for practice, if anything. And I have thought about it. So these are the kind of themes or principles that I've thought about, but they're not necessarily, I don't necessarily want you to talk to these, but if you're struggling, they might provoke some thought. So, yeah, any feedback would be great.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much. That's really interesting, and I was thinking about our patients in the treatment program here, and how they often come to treatment with crippling levels of shame and low self-esteem, and they're not happy with the way they've been living. It's not associated with their own value system. They've drifted away from that. And very much, whatever belief systems people have, I consider the recovery process very spiritual, because they get back to a value system that they can live with and be comfortable and shed some of that shame. And that formation of a new identity as a recovering person rather than as an addicted person.
Yeah.
So, any thoughts? Did anything strike a chord with you, with your patients that you work with, or whatever capacity that you're here in? Anything that rang true?
Or any questions?
Questions, yeah.
Any questions?
It's interesting in...
Can you just say who you are if you're...
Sam Torrance, parish minister, person in recovery, and somebody interested in spirituality. You mentioned, well, there were a couple of things. I'm just wondering, I'm looking for clarification, the secular circle that you had in your subset,
Yeah.
why it wasn't embracing the common subset embraced by the spiritual and the religious, i.e. meaning and values and all of that.
Mm.
You had it as a subset of
Yes,
spiritual.
yeah, that's maybe a slight omission on my part. Yes, so secular beliefs can be a source of meaning and also community. Yeah, so the diagram was not ideal in that sense.
And the second question related to syncretism, because in my experience, I've had a very healthy experience of recovery. I have sensed unity and diversity. I carry a Christian faith, but I don't make it very open.
Yeah.
I'm there to identify with other people in recovery.
Yeah.
But I'm rubbing shoulders with people of different belief systems equally.
Yeah.
It feels more like unity and diversity, when we hold hands and we hug and we're all human beings together, finding our spiritual path.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. Yeah, by syncretism, I just meant, drawing on a range of different types of belief from different traditions, different cultural belief systems, to construct a personal belief system.
Any other questions? Comments? What about your question for us, which was, what does this mean for practice? This is the part where you participate and you speak back to me.
And if you don't have any ideas, I can talk to some, or give you some of my ideas.
Give him a chance first.
Yeah.
I'll start shouting out names.
I just think personally for myself, I think an anti-discriminatory practice is really important, and it's really, really difficult. But I have been in a situation myself, and I do believe in a higher power and everything, you know. And I was speaking about that with a professional, and they said, "Oh, I've had enough therapy not to believe in that." Do you know? And therefore, that kind of left me with a taste in my mouth and made me think, "Well, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure about this professional person." And it changed the relationship that I had with that person. So it's about being accepting of people and their beliefs and their, you know, and their what gives them strength to get through the day. Do you know? So I think that's really important. And accepting it. I like the fact that you highlighted it there. But I do think I think what I like about the whole thing as well is that it's fluid, and that people can come along to recovery as this. You know, they're having a crisis, they're falling to pieces, but there's that hope there to change, and that hope is continuously. When you think of yourself in maturation as you're growing up, you have this belief system when you're a child, and then as you turning into an adult, you change, so you're continuously changing your belief system as you go along. So it's amazing that we don't have to be stuck in one thing, that it's fluid, and that recovery is fluid. Recovery changes people. So I hope that made some sense, didn't it? Well, thanks.
Thank you.
I was just reflecting on the talk as a whole, and you said something at the start which I found quite interesting, and it's a challenge for me personally as well. You mentioned in your work that you had met people with very strong spiritual beliefs, and that had been a launching pad to their own recovery process, but also you'd met people with very strong religious or spiritual belief systems, and they've just gone into a pit of despair. Through this research, has that helped you work out what the difference between those individuals was?
No. No. No, I think there's more. There's often more going on with individuals. In terms, I think the people who didn't survive had a lot of issues with trauma and with guilt and shame and social alienation and things like that, which were never resolved. And while that their spirituality or their faith kind of helped them get so far, or was a resource to a degree, they never resolved those things and never recovered ultimately.
Do you think it's to do with connection and disconnection? Because you can be part of a group but not part of a group. So you can be part of a religious group or a 12-step group or whatever. This is my experience, and you can be really disconnected from what's going on. So you might be going through the motions of spiritual practice, but you're not actually connecting in your inner.
Potentially,
core.
That's definitely part of it.
I think what's interesting is certainly when you pinpointed that actually the type of practices people did in regards to prayer, or I think there have been other activities and things that we had linked into. But that's a lot about just learning to be calm and learning to sit with that, so there was very much an emphasis on that led to those types of meditations. So I think some of the, what I'm trying to say is I think some of the mutual aid meetings or whatever 12-step might not necessarily go into a religious point of view, but the practices that teaches them in regards to that allow them to further go into more spirituality and calmness.
I mean, from my limited knowledge of 12-step groups, they provide a lot of the resources, which are, you could argue, are spiritual resources or spiritual practice or community, without necessarily having the baggage of religion. And I guess some people choose to then embrace the religious side of things or not, or they secularize it. They use it. Some of them are able to use it in a secular framework, whereas others just don't find it helpful at all. They just can't cope with the spiritual side of it at all.
Nathan?
Nathan, used to probably believe in expiation as well. Not so much a question, really, I suppose just a couple of comments. I like that you compared the behaviour of prayer and meditation and readings, the ritualistic nature, as being a replacement in some ways as the ritualistic behaviour of drug taking. For me, in my experience of drug taking, the rituals were a big part of it, and I never made the connection between these two before, and definitely meditation, prayer, reading formed part of my behaviour from one day to the next. And as well, the transformational beliefs, I think there were just 2 people out of the sample of 20 who identify with a transformational sort of belief.
As I defined them, as I defined them.
So, maybe I do have a question. What did you mean by that? I think you maybe mentioned it, but I was kind of in and out at times. I've kind of forgotten. But was that people whose kind of the ideals that they subscribed to were changing as they progressed through their recovery and kind of wrestled with what they identified with as the power that they...
When I meant transformation, I was, I guess, defining that as a kind of a dramatic transformational moment.
An epiphany or a quantum
change. Yeah, so suddenly they have this experience, and suddenly their life, they're suddenly catapulted into a new life where they never use substances again. Whereas other people, it was much more gradual. And interestingly, both those people had essentially an encounter with death, an encounter with their own mortality. And I think that's quite interesting, what happens when we come face to face with our own mortality, and how that potentially changes our perspective on life.
Interestingly, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it tells you that there's people who have an educational experience, and then there's people who got a big spiritual change. So within the big book, it acknowledges that there are people who have spiritual moments that changes their entire life. There's other people, it's a slow educational process of change. And I like how you identified there as well adverse childhood experiences and shame. A lot of people can't sit still in spiritual situations like meditation and things if their head is going about telling them, I feel like a worthless bit of this, I'm crap, I'm not good at this, whatever, is going on in their head. So just sitting to meditate and try and get in touch with higher powers is so painful for them, because deep inside they're in absolute misery and full of shame, and they need to have that therapeutic support to help them overcome whatever happens to them to make them feel like that before they can sit still and feel really they can get in touch with nature, higher power, whatever. So it is a slow process for some people it happens, but it's...
We're actually really... 30-second question and a 30-second answer.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I wonder
Comment.
if you ever come across Urban T. Holmes, 2,000 years research of spirituality. Fitting into that, the 4 quadrants, different ways of connecting spiritually. The thinking, the heart, the active. There are people that just need things to do, service, make some cups of tea, set out the chairs. The heart people need to hear the stories of hope, the sharing, the thinking. They need their books and their meditation. The mystical, contemplative need space. But that's why I like your holistic practice. Second item.
Thank you very much. Do you want to say any closing remarks?
Just to highlight one thing here, the concept of cultural humility, which is just about being open to people's beliefs and listening to their beliefs. And it's cultural competence has been criticised because I don't think any of us can be truly competent in terms of understanding everybody's beliefs, but we can come to people with humility, listening to them and finding out where they're coming from. I think that's the thing that I would highlight. But if anyone wants to email me, my email's at the end, and also I've got a piece of paper at the back. If you want to add your email, if you want to find out further developments of this research, I am interested in developing maybe some guidelines for practice, and also some bits of paper at the end of your rows. There may not be enough, but if you want to put any particular comments down about ideas that you have, you can do that, or just email me.
And if you have any further questions or comments or anything you want to say, I'm sure you can hang around for a minute or two at the end, and Peter will be down at the front. Thank you very much for coming. Can you give me a round of applause for Peter?